Welcome everybody to our Path to Agility webinar for this month. We've got a special guest in Brad today who's going to share a little bit of his experiences with Path to Agility. I'm David Hawks. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit more in a second. And our goal today is for those that are maybe new to Path to Agility, we'll do a little bit of introduction, but so that there's a little bit of context, but mostly we want to hear about some of the experience that Brad's had and kind of walk through like Path to Agility in practice. So that's our goal today. We'll have time for questions at the end, so go ahead and there should be a little Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom window. That's the better place to put questions than in chat. So use the Q&A, not chat, for questions. That allows us to kind of triage them and mark them when they're answered. So go ahead and add those anytime throughout the session. And we've got probably about 30 minutes of content, and then 30-40 minutes, and then we'll move into questions at the back half of the session. All right. So I'm David Hawks with a company called Agile Velocity. We are the creators of Path to Agility, and most of my time is spent working with organizations on their transformation strategy, working with leaders around the mindset shifts and changes that need to happen, and so hopefully I'll share some of the things that we've learned along the way with Path to Agility. And then today we've got Brad. Brad, who are you?
Yeah, so I also work with organizations on their agile transformations as well, and also do some training, in addition to that, and for clients. So I've been doing this for about a dozen years or so now, and always interesting and challenging when we get into large organization change. It's never something that's an easy path to follow, but Path to Agility is a great help in making that happen.
Yeah, cool. So as we're going to dig into components of Path to Agility, we've got it kind of sprinkled throughout. And the main thing that we're trying to accomplish with Path to Agility is to provide guidance in an agile transformation. And what we've done is taken agile adoption patterns and change management patterns and kind of combine them into this framework, this approach for looking at how do I get to there are lots of implementation frameworks like SAFe, Scrum, like the how of agile. This is how do I transform, or how do I change, or how do I shift to agile, is what we're trying to capture here. And one thing that's unique about Path to Agility is it's very much focused on kind of outcomes and capabilities as a way to assess, as opposed to, going in and saying, oh, you're doing good agile because you have stand-ups and you do retros and you use Jira, right? Like that's not a good way of assessing. And we're also trying to look at a way of making sense of progress, right? There's a lot of bad, kind of almost like vanity metrics for agile transformations, like, hey, we launched 20 arts this year. Great, right? Are you any more agile than you were before? Like, how do I assess the progress that I'm making in an outcome and capability-based way? And lastly, we feel like you've got to assess where you are to be able to determine what are the next steps that I need to take. And if you're trying to get from 0 to 100-mile-an-hour agile, you don't just go from 0 to 100. Like you need to go from 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. And Path to Agility can help you make sense out of, okay, given my current state, what are the things that I might need to look at in order to kind of move the needle a little bit forward, right? To progress to kind of that next stage, if you will. So the first thing that we dig into with Path to Agility is what we call the 9 business outcomes. So this is usually the first conversation we have with leaders in an organization is to say, why? Why are you transforming? Why are you doing Agile? Why do you want to change? What is it what is better that you're trying to look at? And so we started with a conversation around these 9 kind of business outcomes. And so I asked Brad to kind of share a little bit about the context of this kind of story that he's going to share, and what they did with these 9 business outcomes.
All right. Thanks, David, for that overview and intro. So I'll be talking about a case study of a client that I'm working with currently. They're a Fortune 500 software company, well-known, large portfolio of software products. I'm working currently with their web production organization. So the website, of course, is one of their primary sales channels. They do tons of business, tons of sales directly to consumers and enterprises by selling on their website. So it's an extremely important website. About 200 people in this part of the organization that maintain that website across their whole portfolio of products. They kind of had a few grassroots teams that made some attempts to adopt Agile practices a while back, saw some promise in that, and then wanted to do things a little bit more systematically. So I came in to coach them in that process, and we've been leveraging Path to Agility. So David just mentioned that Path to Agility starts with these business outcomes. So I always like to say the goal of the transformation is never to do Agile. There needs to be some deeper business outcomes that we're aiming for. And in this particular organization, they selected these 4 out of the 9 outcomes. Normally, I try to steer organizations to narrow it down to just the top 2 or 3. And in fact, that's how they started. Initially, the executive team here chose the top 3 that I've highlighted: employee engagement, speed, and predictability. However, there was one of the execs that didn't participate in that first workshop, and he kind of jumped in and said, there's no way we can move forward without quality as one of our pillars. And so they actually brought in quality as a 4th business outcome. So it's a little less focused. However, I think that quality outcome, or that goal for quality, is actually a nice balance with one of their other outcomes, which is speed. So oftentimes, speed is helpful, but we don't want to sacrifice quality for the sake of speed. So those 2 things, I think, are good balancing outcomes in this particular case. And I think a lesson here is, when you're selecting these outcomes or goals, really critical that you have the right leaders participate in this activity. If we had, we probably would have narrowed it down to 3 rather than 4 to start with. So I will turn things back over to David.
Yeah, and so those conversations are always critical, in the beginning, because often if we would just poll all the leaders walking into the room, they would, and if we just polled them and said, do you think everybody's aligned on the reasons why we're changing? My guess is they all would have been like, yeah, we're all aligned. And then you do that activity, like in breakout groups, or have everybody vote on their top 3 themselves. And it always highlights like, oh, we're all over the place, right? Like, I'm guessing, Brad, the first pass, it wasn't clearly just these 3, right? Like there were votes on likely more than just these 3 or 4.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of those tough choices that they had to make, is, all of these things are good. I think if you asked executives, which of these do you want? They're going to say, well, I want all of those things. But of course, if you're trying to aim for all 9 at the same time, you're not going to be focused. So the important part here is, what do you need to focus on right now? Where is your biggest opportunity for improvement? And focus on that rather than try to boil the ocean and do everything.
Right. And I think that right now, when you put a time horizon on it, I think that's what starts to create it. Like, all right, ultimately we might want customer sat, but right now, speed and predictability and quality are the reasons why we do not have customer satisfaction, right? So, all right, so let's look at the next kind of part of Path to Agility. We call this the kind of 5 stages that's kind of mapped into a normal kind of change curve here. And Path to Agility and a transformation typically starts in what we call the align stage, aligning around why. So a lot of what we were just talking about around the business outcomes. And then the second stage is what we call learn, which is about, are we creating a learning culture? So not just like go to training, right? Training actually starts learning, but learning actually happens in practice, right? We learn by doing. And then really learn is about that foundational learning culture. And then from learning, we start to try and get to a more predictable stage. And what predictability really is about is getting the volatility out. Where's all the variability that's caused in our processes? It could be production issues, so poor quality. It could be changing priorities every week that's causing variability. It could be high dependencies and throwing over the wall and siloed work and not cross-functional teams and swarming, right? So we want to get to predictability because we believe that if we could get more predictable, then we can tune the engine, and then that comes with the 4th stage, which is what we call accelerate. So do we actually start to optimize from beginning to end, concept to cash, the flow of value delivery through the system? And then finally, the 5th stage is what we call adapt, which is if learn is really about an internal learning culture, adapt is kind of about a hyper product learning loop, right? So that we're learning quickly and responding to the market. We're adapting based on what the market is demanding. So these are what we call the 5 stages of Path to Agility. And this is part of where we say we help organizations identify where are you, and that helps us identify what are maybe the next things that we should focus on. All right, and then from those 5 stages, we have what we call the 3 levels. And the easy level that everybody kind of understands is what we call the team level. We've been doing, team level transformation for, over a decade. So Scrum practices, Kanban practices, but what we're, learning with the advent of all the kind of scaling frameworks that have emerged over the last, 5 to 7 years, is really trying to attack this system level of like cross-team coordination that most of our enterprises, have 5 teams, 10 teams, 15 teams that need to coordinate in order to get value out the door. And so we call that the system of value delivery. We need to optimize at that level as well. And then the 3rd level is what we call the organizational level. So organizational is where kind of our culture shift sits, where our leadership, our organizational structure, HR, finance practices, all the things that organizationally impact, and where we start to get more into from a business agility perspective and where the mindset shifts happen. So with those 3 levels and those 5 stages, what we've done is to kind of map out, where we are, from an agile outcome perspective. And we'll see that in a little bit. But I think, Brad, you've got a slide here to kind of map from your case study, kind of how that fit within, just from a context into the levels here.
Yeah, so at my client, we've assigned some overall kind of oversight for these different levels to different groups within the organizations. Starting at the top here, for that broader organizational piece, we formed an Agile leadership team. That's actually one of the elements of the framework that we'll see in a moment. So that consists, as you might expect, of senior level folks for this part of the organization, and myself and some of my fellow coaches at that enterprise level, helping that Agile team, Agile leadership team to guide the whole transformation. At that system level or value stream level, we have formed an Agile community of practice. So people across various different teams and kind of at that cross-team program level. Our enterprise coaches are helping there too. And we've also formed an internal group of coaches. So employees of the client who are essentially going through coach training, learning how to leverage the Path to Agility framework as well. Essentially working towards working myself out of a job. My goal here is not for my client to be dependent on me forever, but for them to build up the internal capabilities there. And then down at the team level, we have another community of practice of Scrum Masters who are coaching their teams. We have coaches working at the team level as well. So that's kind of how we've assigned that ownership for the different levels.
And I think what this highlights is kind of the point of the levels, which is saying that the transformation doesn't happen at just one of these levels, right? It needs all of them. And, again, 10 years ago, I was a part of a lot of team level transformations and we all hit a ceiling, right? It was like, all right, we're doing Scrum and the teams are getting better, but if we didn't have the system or organizational support, then we didn't really get very far, right? But we need to engage at all three of these levels if we're actually going to have sustained change, right? Otherwise, we could do a bunch of stuff at the team level and then the leader, the VP wasn't a part of it and the VP was supportive, but then the VP changes and then who knows what's going to happen afterwards if the rest of the leaders aren't, been a part of things. Yeah,
absolutely. So we're trying to create the structure that enables that sustainability to really kind of build into the overall culture of the organization, these entities and these structural elements that can continue with the transformation and carry it forward.
Okay. So I mentioned an overall map so what we started to map out, this is what we call the 26 Agile Outcomes of Path to Agility, where we've looked at the mapping out what is it that we're trying to achieve organizationally, system level, team level at these stages. And so you can see things like at Align, we're trying to have a clear, compelling purpose for change and a clear, like getting the teams aligned to value. And so Spencer asked a question like, where do value streams fall into the process? And so that teams aligned to value is very much of a activity of kind of mapping out what those value streams are and ensuring that we have the system or the team of teams that is correctly correlated to that, and then optimizing kind of that system of teams across these stages. You see things that learn like, are leaders org level empowering teams, and are teams taking ownership of that, right? Two sides to the coin there. And then from a predict perspective, you see things like ability to focus, reducing complexity, and getting more predictable delivery cadence. So what we do, and you see these kind of arrows, so it's a little, there's some dependency across these different things. And what we use this for is to help an organization assess. And so we'll create kind of a heat map version of this where we kind of see where we are, and Brad's going to show you an example of that. And also on the next slide, you'll see how we start to connect the business outcomes to the Agile outcomes. So speed was one of the business outcomes that this group selected. And what we see is these are let's see, there's 9 highlighted on here. These are the 9 Agile outcomes that most correlate with speed in terms of if you can get kind of these to green, if you will, if you can develop the capability behind kind of these Agile outcomes, and each of these Agile outcomes do break down into more detailed capabilities, we'll see in a second, then these would be the ones that would help us get to speed. It doesn't mean that's where we start, because if you follow the arrows, it will help us see that there's dependency mostly from kind of right to left, but also could be up and down. So, so Brad, kind of share with us a little bit of how that started to manifest within your client.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure that we keep our focus on those business outcomes across the organization. So what I've helped them to visualize in this sort of one-page view of the framework is which of these things are going to impact those 4 business outcomes that we've selected. And I've used these little icons here to help represent that. This helps us see not only which ones are going to help us with each of the outcomes, but also which ones have even higher leverage that are going to help us achieve multiple outcomes there. So we can see here, for example, at the organizational level, ability to focus. If we're able to achieve that, that's going to help us with speed, with predictability, and with employee engagement. So that's probably a high leverage place for that we're going to want to focus on. So I like to remind folks as often as I can that this is what we're aiming for. I always want to keep that focus on those ultimate business outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Now, David mentioned the idea of an assessment or heat map. So the other thing that we've done is we've been tracking and visualizing progress here. So the green, yellow, red colors are probably self-explanatory in terms of indicating where we're at. I've also used this visualization of the arrows sort of at an angle there to indicate which ones are currently improving, to indicate where there's some current progress being made versus something that's more static, isn't really receiving any focus right now. So we do these assessments, try to do this at least quarterly at the organization and system level, hopefully a little bit more often at the team level. So this is a way to visualize where we're at, and based on those yellow arrows that are at a little angle, we can see, well, which of our outcomes are we really focused on improving at the moment. I'll hand things back over to David to explain that next level of detail in Path to Agility.
Yeah, so what you see here is the kind of connection of the different elements of Path to Agility. So that first kind of honeycomb, if you will, of the 9 business outcomes, the yellow cards that we saw earlier. And then that we saw the connection to the 26 Agile outcomes, the things on the map. And then what we're going to see in this section is how those break down into kind of capabilities. So there's a parent-child between Agile outcome and capabilities. Every capability rolls up to an Agile outcome. We've mapped out 85 Agile capabilities. And ultimately, those will get solved by implementing Agile practices. Things like, we're going to do retrospectives, or we're going to have a portfolio Kanban, or we're going to do, roll out safe and have an art, or we're going to do a scrum of scrums, right? Or we're going to use Kanban. There's an infinite number of Agile practices in the world that we can choose from. And that's what makes kind of transformations complex, because there is no one way and there is no right one way. So what we feel like one of the biggest failure patterns in transformation is people are focused implementing, they go from right to left, right? They start with implementing practices and are hoping for some business outcome, and they don't understand. And we feel like that's backwards. We feel like you need to start with the business outcomes, identify what kind of build your backlog of things you want to achieve from an Agile outcomes, and then that will dictate kind of different capabilities. So I think on the next slide, we show kind of how these capabilities, like, so the agile outcome of compelling purpose could be broken down into things like urgency created, create a guiding vision, have clear objectives. And here are some criteria on how would we know that we have achieved this thing. And so that's how we go through and help to kind of assess in a capability and outcome-based way of where we are organizationally. And on the next slide, we just kind of show a very zoomed out view of the items in the light blue box in the middle are those 26 Agile outcomes, and everything around it are the 85 Agile capabilities that are connected, that those kind of decompose into, if you will. So Brad's going to show kind of how he leveraged this in terms of helping teams have a conversation around kind of where they are, so that then they can identify action items that they would take.
Yeah, so we've been leveraging a spreadsheet format that captures all those different levels of detail that David just shared. And that rolls up to this top level view. And here I'm showing an example of several teams that have gone through and assessed for each of those capabilities where they're at. And those roll up to this red, yellow, green chart here to indicate where each team is at. And of course, along with this, helping them figure out what do we likely need to work on next in order to improve our own capabilities. Next, I'll show some detail around what's behind each one of these red, yellow, green indicators and the percentages here. So behind each one of these individual cells, as we dig in deeper, here's the detail that David referred to earlier behind each of the capabilities and then the practices. So over here on the far left of the table, you'll see how things roll up to that top level Agile outcome, one of those boxes on the previous page, and then the list of capabilities associated with it. So here we're looking at an outcome called reduce cycle time. And you can see that there are several capabilities that this one consists of: focus to finish, deliver small increments of value, et cetera, in that third column. And there's a description and some detailed acceptance criteria. So each team can go through and with a coach's help, interpret what does this mean, where are we at? And we're also able to customize this a little bit. So one of the great things about Path to Agility is that it does provide a good level of guidance without being overly prescriptive here. So in this case, you'll see an example in that last row of where, in this context, because we're doing web production and not building, say, a software product, some of these things don't really apply directly in this context. So we've marked one item here as not applicable for this particular team. So we've got that flexibility to tweak and tailor this to the specific needs of one team or a whole organization there. And teams can, as you see here, they can capture their insights and they can know what do we need to do next to kind of get to that next level, to get better.
So we had a question come in there, Brad, that I think would fit in well here. So it was, and I think you've answered it, but let's make sure we're explicit about it. So the question was kind of on the percentages on the previous slide. How do we come up with the assessment percentages? Who is involved in determining the percentages? So these are all a roll up of the drop down that you see under Sonic and Morpheus. So since this version, we've released a new version that has kind of five levels, from like not met to partially met, or to slightly met, partially met, mostly met, and fully met, which are like 25%. So those kind of equate to either a 0, 25, 50, 60, 75, 100%. And then these are all rolling up to the percentage that we see underneath reduced cycle time. So that's how you get the percentages. But Brad, maybe I think you hit on it, but like who's in the room when you're doing
Right.
this?
Yeah, so this will depend a little bit from team to team. I certainly want to work with each team scrum master or coach. And if there's any other key players in the team, we want them to weigh in. So I want at least a cross-functional kind of representation of people who dig into this and make that assessment. Certainly, if you can, it's great if you can get an entire team to go through this together and talk about it. And so they get more awareness about where they're at and where their gaps might be. Not always possible to do this with every team member, because this is a fairly time-consuming activity. It's not just just tick the boxes, make a quick guess about where we're at. Really requires a little bit of coaching and a good solid understanding of Agile practices, Agile principles, to help people understand what these things really mean. Right. Certainly, I've found cases where with a team that's relatively new, they will assess themselves overly optimistically. They'll say, "Yeah, we're good at that. We're good at that." And then a few months later, they'll go back and they'll be like, "Oh, we didn't even know what that meant when we did that a few months ago." So we realize now we actually have a ways to go in that area.
Yeah, we actually see a pattern of the scores go down after the first kind of assessment, and it's not because they got worse; it's because they got smarter.
Right? Yeah, it's a case of you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
when you do that first assessment.
But you also hit on the mitigation strategy is this should be coach led, coach facilitated. And it's not just, hey, what do y'all think? Oh, we think we're great. It's like, all right, this is what this really means. And trying to kind of, address that from the beginning of trying to, use this as a way of educating along the way.
All right. So wanted to zoom back out now to kind of the bigger picture level. As an enterprise coach, I work a lot with that leadership team and helping them understand where they're at. One of the things that's happened in the past 3 months or so is the leadership team has kind of organically realized, hey, there's several things that we want to focus on right now that they felt like were a little bit chaotic, and somewhat intuitively, what they focused on here was predictability. The leadership team, maybe not surprisingly, really wanted to get to that sense that they felt things were a little bit more stable. And so I've helped them to understand here with many of the current actions that they're undertaking at that leadership level, how those tie into these specific outcomes here that relate, all of them in this case relate to predictability. So even when the leadership team isn't explicitly directly leveraging Path to Agility and saying, hey, we are working on our ability to forecast, I can show them how what they have prioritized ties back here. And so they can see how it fits into that bigger picture. Now, as a coach, besides showing them where they're at, one of the best things that I love about Path to Agility is I can leverage this to help them see what we might want to do next. So that's kind of that's usually one of the hardest things to figure out is, okay, well, we've done a bunch of stuff. Here's where we're at, but where do we go from here? What's the next thing that's going to help us out? So this has allowed me to work with them to show, well, given your goals, your business outcomes, we can see here several items that are still in the red, that really haven't moved forward, and they're related to your business outcomes, your goals. So if you want to make progress on those goals, you probably want to turn those red arrows at least into yellow arrows and be working towards green on those items as your next steps in the overall organizational transformation. All right, I want to just summarize some of the advantages that we've noticed by using Path to Agility here. And number one for sure is keeping that focus on the business outcomes. It's really, really easy in these Agile adoption efforts for people to just focus on checking the boxes on practices. Yet we're doing stand-ups, yet we're doing retros, yet we're doing sprint planning. And then they feel like they're all good. So this brings that focus back to, are we achieving the higher level goals? I love that it gives that guidance without being overly prescriptive. There is no one best way to go through this that works in every organization. There's tons of complexity here, and the framework lets you look at that bigger picture, identify what that next move might be without saying you have to go through these 12 steps in this order. Revealing blind spots, another great thing. We may feel like, hey, we're doing pretty good. We feel like we have a pretty stable system in place here. However, this will help you realize, oh, well, if we really want to continue improving, we still have some gaps to be filled. So it'll point that out. We've got a number of coaches working at different levels and different parts of the organization. This helps all of us stay aligned. What are we working on? What are we talking about with the different teams and different groups in the organization? As you saw here, it's a great framework for assessing progress. So if people want to know where we're at, we have that nice sort of one-page view of where we're at organizationally. So those are some of the great benefits that we've seen by using the framework here.
So that's the end of the content. So if there's any other questions, I see a couple queuing up. So definitely add those questions into the Q&A panel down at the bottom. Excuse me. While y'all are doing that, I'll just share kind of two ways of kind of learning more. So the first one is I think it's every other month, we're doing the Path to Agility Practitioner Workshop. I see Rachel just posted a link in the chat. So this is a one-day course that kind of introduces you to Path to Agility and all the elements and how to use it, and walks you through kind of you leave with, all right, I'm enabled to kind of go use this within my organization and licensed to use it with your organization. So you're certified as a Path to Agility practitioner. And then the other is from an enterprise licensing, if your organization is interested in using this for guiding their transformation, this is how an organization would enable themselves to kind of use that. And Rachel posted a link to that as well. So let's go ahead and answer some questions that have come in. So let's see, Bob Scott, in terms of the team level assessment, do we do periodic reassessment after the initial exercise? What frequency is recommended? How do we determine that time span? So maybe Brad, you kind of chime in with what you're doing, and then I'll kind of chime in with some other experiences that we see.
Yeah, those top levels, the organization and what we call the system level, I think around quarterly is probably about the right frequency. I mean, those larger organizational changes typically don't happen overnight. So you're probably not going to see huge movement in a short period of time there. At the team level, maybe monthly, every couple of months. And then going all the way back to those business outcomes, those highest level business goals, I think those are worth reassessing, maybe annually or so. In fact, with this client I'm working with right here, they're about to get into their annual planning for 2022. And one of the items to consider there is whether those 4 goals that they selected initially are still the right ones. They might decide, for example, that, we feel like we've got the predictability part down pretty good now, and maybe we want to shift more towards one of the other outcomes instead, or they might realize, hey, we initially picked 4. We don't want to kind of add more. Maybe predictability is good, but we still need to work on quality and employee engagement more. So they might narrow it down a little bit.
Yeah. So we don't have any other questions, so I'll add a couple other things to this one and stall in case folks have any other questions for Brad and how he used it. But the other thing we see, so I agree with I think the most common pattern is either twice a quarter or once a quarter, right, or every other month, right, somewhere in that. As far as frequency, though, I would say the best pattern I've seen is a fairly active Agile leadership team. So remember, that was the group that was kind of driving the transformation, and they were working with a backlog based on Agile capabilities, and then they were working in 2-week sprints. So all they were doing, instead of doing like a big heavy reassessment every month, like and looking at everything in the framework and like reassessing all 85 capabilities, what they were doing was just as they finished work, they reassessed the capabilities that they just were working on. And so that's ideal, is that, hey, we're working on this capability. We just did some tasks. We finished it. All right, we said it was slightly met before. Have we moved it up to partially met? Have we moved it up to mostly met? Like, and they're just doing a couple every 2 weeks, right? As opposed to looking at all 85 every month, right? And so if you can do it that way, that's where it becomes really no burden at all, right? It's just kind of integrated into the work that they're doing. All right, Zara's got a question. How would you recommend starting at the team and perhaps system level to show value of P2A at the organizational level? Brad, you got a thought on that one?
Yeah, so I would say in my experience, starting at that team level, as David mentioned earlier, what often happens there is you might have some good success demonstrated at that team level, but you'll probably run into a ceiling fairly quickly where you'd be like, hey, our team's doing as good as we can, but until there are some more structural changes in terms of things like the way teams are organized and how different organization functions work together so they're not siloed, and leadership practices help support what we're doing, you kind of reach that ceiling pretty quickly. Now, I think if that's the best you can do, if you don't have that senior level exec support, but you want to sort of do this grassroots approach, Path to Agility certainly can help you at that team level and help your team to get good, which hopefully then would get the attention of higher level executives that would make note of this one team that's doing really great work, may open them up to considering adopting those practices more broadly. So yes, it can help at that level, at that individual team level, and again, maybe open the door to senior management, senior leadership to consider things more broadly.
Right. Yeah. And I think, because you can say you were, hey, I'm a senior scrum master or a team coach that's only really engaged with a couple teams. That's my area of influence or authority, right? You still could, just do it like the assessment that Brad used. Have that conversation with the team, have the team come up with action items, have the team create a view of where their current state is, and being able to show that visualization to leaders will start to allow them to connect to, oh, that's really cool what we can see in terms of the agile progress we're making within the team, or if you had 2 teams, and going, oh, all right, and you leave like the system in org blank, or the teams assess the system that they're within, and then that could start to open their eyes to, oh, there is a way to actually visualize this organizationally, right? So you definitely could start at the team level, but to kind of David's question in the chat, yeah, you're going to hit a ceiling if you can't chip away, but Path to Agility could help you visualize it in a way that helps leaders engage and see the problem for themselves.
One other thing to add here, in terms of getting that leadership engagement, I think Path to Agility is really great in that sense, because when we start with those business outcomes, things like speed, predictability, productivity, executives and leaders look at that and they say, yeah, we want that. If you go to your leadership team and say, hey, we want to do Agile, they're going to look at you like, why? Why do I care if you're doing the Agile process or the jelly bean process? Like, what I care about is, are we delivering more value to our customers? Are my employees engaged? Do we have high quality? So those are the kind of outcomes they want to achieve. And if you can help them see, hey, we can use Agile practices as a way to achieve these higher level goals that you care about as a C-level exec or even a VP, then that helps to get that buy-in.
All right. Well, we are coming up on time. Give people time between this session and the next session. I know we all appreciate that. Thanks for Brad. Thank you for joining and kind of sharing your experience today. And thanks to everybody that joined on the webinar. We will record and send out the links that Rachel posted. So those will get emailed out to you. And those that are catching the recording later, thanks for joining as well.